All right, so on to week 12 study guide. So we had this question, what ways did Ataturk change Turkey? I'll actually answer that with number 3. I just wanted to highlight, I wanted to kind of, the reason I assigned that video was I thought it would deepen your knowledge. So it's not so much that the information is different, it's just that it's helping kind of repeat it in a different way. So I'll just skip on to number 2. What was the Armenian genocide? Why did it happen? Why was the Islamic Ottoman Empire able to tolerate Armenians while Turkish nationalists were not? So basically, remember in the old Ottoman Empire, you could, Christians and Jews could pay a tax as people of the book to keep their religion. And as long as they did that, they were fine and they were tolerated and they pretty much were left alone in many ways. Now, they suffered, they were second-class people, in a sense, second-class subjects, citizens, but they were allowed to exist. However, for the nationalist perspective, they looked at people like the Christian Armenians and said, look, these people have a different language than us. They're a different ethnic group. Their religion is different from us. Now, they didn't really care so much what the religion was. In Islam, traditionally, they could be tolerated, these Christian Armenians. But for the Turks, the nationalist Turks, they said, oh, we don't like the fact these people are a different religion, not so much because their religion is wrong, but because it's different from us. So they can't be tolerated. Right? So under the old Islamic system of the Ottoman Empire, Armenian Christians were fine as long as they paid their tax. But under this growing nationalism, these Armenians are just too different. Right? They have their own language and they have a different religion from us. So it's interesting here. I like to point out that, and this is, I'm sorry, going to lead to these kind of anti-Armenian massacres. Now, I like to point out, as a specialist in religion, is people often will say, oh, religion and violence, those things always go together, but secular ideals are not violent. Well, here's an example of secular violence, right? Nationalism is primarily secular. When religion dominated the thinking of the Ottoman Empire, Armenians could be tolerated, but when it shifted to more secular ideas, that's when you got the violence. Now, what happens is the wartime conditions allowed the Turkish government to move Armenians. Basically, they said, oh, the Armenians are going to rebel. They're going to try and take advantage of the war to work with the Russians, who are also Christians, to take advantage of the situation and attack us. Now, it was true there were some Armenians who did this. But instead of simply punishing the few Armenians who did try and fight the Ottoman Empire during World War I, they punished everyone. They said all Armenians have to move. Right? They have to leave the area where they have traditionally lived and move. And on the way, a lot of them died or were simply killed. The Turkish government, or the Ottoman government, did not attempt to make sure that the Armenian people who were being forced to move would have adequate food or clothing or water or anything. And they were often put in prisons or just abandoned. Or sometimes, like I said, just flat out killed. So I want to stress here, notice the Armenians are not being punished as individual people. They're being punished as Armenians. The fact that they are Armenians makes them an enemy, not the fact of what they do as individuals. It's just their very fact of existence makes them a danger. And so it's important to understand, this is why this is often called the first genocide of the 20th century, because this is very much what happened, similar to what happens to Jewish people in some ways. It's just in the case of the poor Jews in Europe, it's even more severe. But wartime conditions allows this kind of thing to happen. You know, people aren't really keeping a close eye. They can't do much about it. And people get killed in wartime all the time. So that gives the Ottoman government the opportunity to kind of carry out these terrible acts. And just to, again, draw this connection more strongly. John, honey, you'll have to leave if you're not quiet. To make this connection even more strongly, Adolf Hitler himself said, who, after all, speaks today of the annihilation of the Armenians? Meaning, people have kind of forgotten this, and so it's okay for me to take action against the Jews because once I'm done, people will forget it as well. So we had this next question. What were the characteristics of the Turkish state that Ataturk established? So after World War I, the Ottoman Empire, because it lost, was cut down to basically just Turkey. There were serious civil wars and foreign wars over territory, mostly with Greece and Britain between 1920 and 1923. Turkey would hold together thanks to the victories of Ataturk, a man originally named Mustafa Kemal, but he took the name Ataturk, meaning father of the Turks, and he could now transform Turkey into a modern nation state. So his vision of a modern nation state is a secular one. He will get rid of the Islamic law that governed Turkey. He will also get rid of the caliphate. Remember, the Turks claimed to have the caliph. And instead, he'll establish a republic with a powerful president. He's basically a dictator. And you can see him there trying to modernize, in a sense. Notice he's wearing a European-style suit. Before this time period, so one thing I have to stress, the Turks and the Arabs are different ethnic groups. They have different languages. Now, British people and French people and Germans all use a very similar alphabet to write their languages, right? Well, the Turks had traditionally written Turkish in Arabic, using an Arabic script phonetically, like how we would use, Americans might write English in using a Roman alphabet. And what Mustafa Kemal did, Ataturk did, was he said, we're not going to write in Arabic, Turkish in Arabic anymore. We're going to write Turkish using a Western-style alphabet. And so he's engaging in a kind of he's engaging in kind of secular reforms. Under him, women will get the right to vote and be elected to office. So this is kind of an interesting change, an interesting transformation. It looks kind of similar to Mexico, doesn't it? Just not as violence against Islam as as the Mexican government was against Catholicism. But it is kind of the same thing. Let's push out religion. Let's bring in a modern secular style government. Now, I had this question, what of the old empire, right? What happened to the old Ottoman Empire? And that goes to question 4. What happened to former territories of the Ottoman Empire, such as Syria and Iraq? So the British supported Arab nationalists during World War I against Turkey. They said basically, if you rebel against the Turks, we'll build you an Arab state. The Arabs keep their promise, the British do not. Instead, what's going to happen is the territory of the old Ottoman Empire, which would include all this, would be divided up. Turkey would become an independent state, but Syria would become a French mandate. Iraq and Transjordan would become a British mandate. I won't go into detail about what we mean by mandates. For our purposes, it's basically a colony that you hold through the League of Nations. But basically, just think of a mandate as a colony. So the French and the British were very interested for strategic reasons, and also they wanted oil, which was in these areas. So instead of these places becoming independent, the British got some parts and the France got some parts. Now, there was this other question, how did France maintain power in Syria? And basically what they did, and I talked about this in the true and false section, but Syria is diverse, but the majority of people were Sunni Arabs. They wanted to be independent, right? Because if they were independent, they'd be in charge. But there were oppressed minorities like the Alawites who were Shia, and they did not really want the Arab Sunni to be in charge because that would lead to them being oppressed because they had been oppressed in the past. So the French said, hey, Alawites, you want to help us govern? You'll have a position of power and you can get revenge on the people who've oppressed you for hundreds of years. And the Alawites said, sounds like a good deal to us. And we call this strategy kind of divide and conquer, right? The French do not have enough people to just kind of govern on their own, so they're going to look to the help of a minority like the Alawites. The Sunni didn't want to help the French govern because they wanted to be independent and be in charge themselves. The Alawites knew that they would not be in charge if they were to become independent immediately. They thought the French could protect them. And as an aside, as I mentioned before, eventually what happens is when Syria does become independent, the Alawites are still in charge. They're still in charge today. Assad, the dictator of Syria, is an Alawite. Why did Indians expect more freedom from Britain? How did the British respond to Indians who wanted more freedom? So remember, national self-determination only applied to the people who lost World War I, did not apply to British colonies, for example. The British had the Indians had a growing sense of Indian identity and nationalism. And because the British civilization emphasized democracy, they did allow Indians to have some freedom. So the Indians, for example, did have some freedom of the press, some freedom of speech. During World War I, huge numbers of Indians supported Britain by fighting in the British Army during World War I. There were lots of Indians even in the trenches fighting, and so they expected to be rewarded. They had shown that they were loyal subjects of the British Empire. They expected to be rewarded for that loyalty. But instead, Britain withdrew freedoms and increased its control over India. Right? So you've got a group of people who were loyal, expect to be rewarded for that loyalty to the Indians, and instead they are going to be punished. They're going to lose their freedom. They will protest, and the British will respond to protests with violence. This is a famous area where there was a protest in Amritsar, where the British attacked protesters and killed a significant number. Now, how did Gandhi seek Indian independence? Who influenced him? Who did he influence? So some Indians said, we need to be violent. The British are using violence. They're shooting us down like this. We need to be violent too. Gandhi said, no, we need to be nonviolent. And so Gandhi wants Indian independence nonviolently. He's influenced in part by people like Henry David Thoreau, who himself was influenced by Jesus, right? Henry David Thoreau was an early 19th century American philosopher, what was called a transcendentalist, who advocated civil disobedience. And he was inspired in part by Jesus in the New Testament. So Gandhi read him, was inspired by him and Indian ideas, and then he influenced Benjamin Mays, the mentor of Dr. Martin Luther King. So that's kind of an interesting thing, I think. But to kind of continue, right, how did Gandhi seek Indian independence? He was opposed to violence. He wanted to use things nonviolently. Now, what's interesting about Gandhi was he was a Western educated lawyer. He actually got a law degree from Britain. But then he dressed like this. And you may say, wow, that's kind of weird. Why would you dress like that? That is not how Western educated lawyers usually dress. And there's a reason why he did that. He's dressing like an Indian holy man. Basically, if you study Hinduism, one important aspect of Hinduism is this belief that the universe that we experience is not really real, and we should be detached from the universe. And it makes sense. One way you would detach from the universe was not worrying about what you wear. You should wear very simple clothing. In fact, you maybe even should wear clothing that doesn't really protect you from the environment to show that you're able to master yourself and you're not impacted by the illusion that is the universe. So that's why he's dressed like this. He's dressed as a traditional Hindu holy man. And he realized that, look, there's this thing called the National Congress. And this is kind of a club of individuals who are pro-Indian autonomy or Indian independence. And they want to bring Indian independence, but they want to do it, but they're mostly educated people. Most Indians were not educated. The majority of Indians couldn't even read. So what happened was, the majority of people could not read. So in order to get to actually bring independence, they need to have a mass movement. The only way to attract the masses who were not educated was to use traditional ideas like, say, Indian holy man. And there you can see him there. So the mass majority of Indians could understand this. They maybe couldn't read, but they could understand this and say, okay, this is a leader that we should follow. And I chose this picture in particular because he is weaving cloth. Remember I said how the British, because the British initially came to India in order to buy cloth. But because of the Industrial Revolution and because they were able to colonize India, India went from making cloth to sell the British to making growing cotton to sell the British, which they then changed into cloth and sold back to the Indians. And Gandhi said, you know what? If we want to get the British are here to make money. If they can't make money anymore, they'll leave. So he said we should start making our own cloth. Again, and he spent, even when he was this important political leader, he spent hours a day making cloth. So you can kind of see that idea there of using traditional ideas while also marrying them to modern ideas, because he's going to engage in nationalism, anti-British nationalism. We want the British out. But we're not going to do that through violence. We're going to do that through boycotts, through not buying British cloth, and through non-cooperation. If we don't like a law, we're going to not follow it. And this is what we would call civil disobedience. And you can see here he's getting ideas like that from people like Henry David Thoreau, this American philosopher, but he's also drawing on traditional Indian ideas as well, especially the idea that nonviolence could be kind of power that could transform society. So to give you an example of one of his successful movements, and that's him back there engaged in the March to the Sea. Basically, the British had created a tax on salt, and they made it illegal to make salt yourself. Now you may say, well, how do you make salt? Easy. You go to the ocean, you get a bunch of water, and you boil it. What's left is the salt. Now this is a big deal because in much of India is very hot, and in areas that are hot, you need a lot of salt because you're constantly losing it as you sweat. So a lot of people were very upset about this because this impacted like everyone. If you were poor, or rich, you still needed salt, and this hurt poor people more because they didn't have as much money to buy salt. So Gandhi said, this is our issue. We are going to raise a major protest against this. And a lot of intellectuals, a lot of people who were part of the National Congress said, this is crazy. This isn't a big deal. We should focus on freedom of speech or freedom of the press. And Gandhi's like, no, you're wrong. That's only something a few Indians care about. Who cares about freedom of the press when you can't read? But all Indians are impacted by this issue of the collection of salt, right? All Indians are impacted by this. So this allowed him to unite many Indians, hundreds of thousands of Indians from all walks of life, engaged in this march to the sea to get salt. And so the British were in a very difficult position. How can they justify violence against these people? These are just people, hundreds of thousands of people literally walking to go make salt. How can we just attack them? They're nonviolent. They are breaking the law, but we can't just go in and shoot them all. And there's too many people to imprison. And this looks really good on the international stage. This makes Indians look like very good, civilized people. You're sympathetic to them. They're not throwing bombs or shooting anyone. They're behaving in a very orderly manner, making a very reasonable demand. So a lot of people will support them. And this works. The taxes dropped, and this gives Indians confidence to continue their movement for independence. This next question, who made it the first United Front? Who were they fighting against? This is from this one on China. The first United Front was a mixture of the Chinese nationalists and the Chinese communists. They were fighting against the warlords. Once they defeated the warlords, then the nationalists attacked the communists. And Chiang Kai-shek slaughtered a bunch of them. Basically, it fell apart because they were only united by a common enemy. Once the common enemy was defeated, they decided, hey, we're just going to do our own thing. How do Koreans react to the promises of Versailles and national self-determination? What happened to them? Please excuse me, I need to take a drink. So, remember the Treaty of Versailles promised national self-determination. Now, Koreans had been annexed in 1910, made part of the Japanese Empire. The Japanese had basically completely restricted freedom of speech and assembly. There were no free newspapers in Korea. The only newspapers existed were run by the Japanese government. One exception was religion, in a large part because Japan did not want to make Britain and the United States too angry, and there were a lot of British and American missionaries in Korea. So because they had to respect some freedom of religion. So Woodrow Wilson called for national self-determination. Christian leaders and leaders of other religious groups, they believed Wilson. They thought that national self-determination would apply to Korea. Spoiler alert, it doesn't, because Japan was on the victorious side, so it's not applied to their colony. The Koreans didn't know this. So they will launch a massive independent movement, which about 1 million people participated in, and it basically just involved Koreans running around saying Korean independence for 10,000 years and waving flags. And the Japanese responded. They freaked out because they were so shocked that the Koreans were able to organize this thing without the Japanese knowing. And about 1 million will respond with violent oppression. They'll be machine gunning and sending cavalry with swords in to attack the demonstration. So this will be put down. It will fail, but it leads to growing nationalism. More and more Koreans say, we don't really like being oppressed by the Japanese. We want independence. And I gave you an example of this woman named Yu Kwon-soon. And I think she just shows how things are changing in Korea. She was a girl from the provinces, right? So she's the kind of person who would not normally take part in political or social movements, because not only is she a woman, she's also a young woman, and she's from the countryside. But her parents were early converts to Methodist Christianity. They became Protestant Christians, and this connected them to a missionary network. And one of the Western missionaries noticed that Yu Kwon-soon was really smart and arranged for her to receive a modern education at Ewha University in Seoul, in the capital. And a lot of the people were teaching were American missionaries who taught things like about the American Revolution, which, of course, teaching American history, what's our history? It's the history of gaining independence against people who we thought were oppressing us. So this inspired many Koreans. It inspired her to participate in the independence movement. And I want to stress, she wasn't simply a person who was waving flags and shouting slogans. She was organizing people to do this. She was passing out the flags, passing out the constitutions, passing out copies of the Declaration of Independence, helping to decide when they would actually launch their independence movement. So she was really a leader. I want to stress that. She was imprisoned by the Japanese, beaten, and eventually died under the terrible conditions she lived under. So this shows a kind of change, right, that you were having. There's a transformation in Korea. Women are gaining new opportunities, right? This would not have happened in the past. Thanks to these Protestant missionaries and their connection, their network, this woman has new opportunities, but there's also tragedy, right? They're dying. She dies trying to live out these new opportunities. How is Japan becoming more like the West? Why did it turn from the West? So Japan was enjoying an economic boom during World War I because they were making money selling stuff to the Europeans who were busy at war. And there was also a growth in parliamentary democracy at this time. Japan was increasing its democracy, expanding its democracy. This led to universal manhood suffrage in 1925. And so that made it legal for all men to vote. Now, women didn't have the right to vote. This is a little bit late compared to other countries. But I want to stress, in the 1920s, democracy in many ways was expanding in Japan. And there was a general embrace of Western culture. This is a image from a cosmetic magazine. And it's interesting, this Japanese woman looks almost like a Western person. Right? If it wasn't for this writing, you would maybe think that she was a Westerner. And also, I want to point out, she's wearing a perm, which was considered a modern style of haircut, right? We don't think of perms that way, but they were at this time period. So this shows the embrace of Western culture. As a quick aside, during World War II, Japan banned the perm. The perm became illegal. But Japanese women still got perms anyway. So I just find that fascinating. Now, what changed, right? Why did it turn from the West? Remember, international trade fell apart after the Depression. The Japanese were highly dependent on international trade. And the Western liberal democracies that had championed international trade and forced Japan to take part in international trade, remember Matthew Perry forced Japan to open, they will turn away from international trade and engage in these tariff wars where they'll put all these tariffs out, tax on imports. And also, liberal democracy seemed unable to solve Japanese problems. So increasingly, Japanese people say, look, international trade has fallen apart. We can't trust the Western liberal democracies. They're just looking out for themselves. We need to try a new system. How did the Versailles Treaty treat China? How did Chinese people react to such treatment? So remember, there was no effective central government after the fall of the Qing. This allowed Western countries and Japan to develop imperialism in Japan to expand their power. This meant more Chinese became nationalistic. Now, China and Japan were both on the same side of the Allies during World War I. However, what happened was, remember, Japan helped participate. They attacked some German-controlled territories in China and took them. China sent laborers to the Western Front to help dig trenches. So when the Versailles Treaty was signed, China hoped to get back the German-controlled portions of their country, right? Japan had seized those parts of the country from Germany, but they were Chinese. So the Chinese expected that they would get them back, because after all, it was their territory. However, Japan was allowed to keep them. And basically what had been found out was, in order to get Japan to enter the war, the British and the French had promised that Japan could keep that territory after the war. So you can guess the Chinese felt betrayed. They had helped in the war. They had materially contributed to the war effort. And they found out that the people they had been helping had not only refused to help them get back their own territory. And I want to stress this is Chinese territory. In addition, they had promised this while they were negotiating with the Chinese to enter the war. So the Chinese really felt betrayed. What was the Nationalist Party in the Great Northern Expedition? Why was Chiang Kai-shek not successful in developing China as Mexico was? So Sun Yat-sen dies in 1925, so leadership of the Nationalist Party will pass to Chiang Kai-shek, often called Generalissimo. Look at him dressed there. He is he's clearly a military man first and foremost. He will launch what's called the Great Northern Expedition. He and his party, Sun Yat-sen, were strong in the south of China, so they were invading north. That's why it's called the Great Northern Expedition, which did successfully defeat many of the warlords. Who are warlords? Guys like this, depicted here as strangling the Chinese people along with the Western empires. He will defeat the warlords, unite much of the country under Nationalist Party rule. And in many ways, he wants to be similar to Lazar Cardenas. He wants to kind of develop a powerful country and stable country like Lazar Cardenas was. However, he's not going to be as successful as Mexico because Japan will invade, starting in 1931, and then there'll be a Chinese civil war, so he has to fight the communists. So he's trying to develop economically while facing a civil war and a foreign invasion. That's kind of hard to do. What were the characteristics of the Russian Empire? What was under the rule of the Tsar? How did that contribute to the rise of communism? So the Russian Empire refused to have a liberal democratic revolution. They refused to have a political revolution, basically. They did not go towards democracy. Remember when Japan fought Russia in the Russo-Japanese War, Japan was more democratic than Russia was. However, the Russians do accept some forms of nationalism. Basically, they will emphasize Russianness, and especially Orthodox Christianity. To be a true Russian, you should be an Orthodox Christian. And that was united in the person of the Tsar, who was an absolute monarch who received his power from God on high and no one else. And that was basically the kind of political theory. So they did accept some aspects of nationalism, not the democracy part. They did of the political revolution, but they accept the nationalist part of the political revolution, focused around the idea of Russian ethnicity and Orthodox Christianity, unified in an absolute monarch, seen as here, Tsar Nicholas II. And they used lots of violence to suppress anyone who wanted to do anything differently. So if you wanted to try and change the system, you might get visited by the secret police. You could be beaten up or killed. In the 19th century, they did adopt some industrialization. Their economy was too rural for it to happen on its own. So the state stepped in because they wanted modern weapons and things like that, and engaged in state-sponsored industrialization concentrated in a few cities. So you did have some workers in those cities. And in particular, those workers, as well as peasants and some of the nobility, wanted change. They said, we don't like this absolute monarchy. Some of us would like a liberal democratic revolution. Some of us would like something more radical. Now, why did the Revolution of 1917 succeed while the Revolution of 1905 fail? What form of government did the revolution initially establish? So in 1905, there was an attempted revolution during the Russo-Japanese War. It's very complex, but basically what happened was the army stayed loyal and put down the revolutionaries. But in World War I, the army was suffering a great deal. It lost a lot of people. There wasn't enough food or guns to supply the army. The generals were incompetent. Tsar Nicholas II was even more incompetent when he tried to lead the army. So the army turned against the regime. So what happened was in 1905, the army stayed loyal. That led to the revolutionaries being put down. In 1917, the army turned against the regime. And so what happened, there was a revolution, but it led to the establishment of a republic, not a communist state, but a republic. There was then an attempt at establishing a liberal democracy by that republic. However, they decide they want to continue the war. So remember, the army turned against the regime in part because of the suffering and how it had suffered during the war, but the new government is going to continue the war. So that's a problem. So how did Vladimir Lenin launch a successful communist revolution when communism was not supposed to happen in Russia? So remember, communism was not supposed to happen in Russia because it was primarily a rural country. Communism predicted to be the workers who would lead the revolution. Excuse me. Well, Vladimir Lenin said, you know what? We can have what's called a vanguard party. Instead of letting just a communist revolution kind of happen naturally among the workers, we will use the party to organize workers in industrialized cities, because there are a few industrialized cities in Russia, and we will launch a successful revolution. And that's what he does. They political power is concentrated in the cities where the workers are concentrated, so that allows the communists to seize the cities and then seize the rest of the country. And they don't really say so much, hey, we're going to bring communism. They promise peace, meaning we'll end the war. They promised land, meaning that we will make sure that all peasants will get some land. And they promised bread, meaning you'll have enough food to eat. Sadly, they violated all three of these promises. They would not bring peace. They'd bring war and suffering. They did not bring land. The land would be given to the peasants, only be taken away a few years later, and a lot of people would starve to death. But in any case, people believed these promises and supported them, and so they won a civil war with foreign intervention, and were allowed to take power. How did Joseph Stalin seek to deal with these problems and bring development? How successful was he? What did he focus on? So real quick, the big problems, this you kind of have to understand 21 to understand 22. The big problems the Soviet Union faced, it had not been a very industrialized country. That's why it suffered so much during World War One. The war had destroyed much of its industrial capacity, so it was now in a worse shape than it was. And then they had a civil war, so they were already weak economically before World War One. Now they're even weaker. So how do you deal with that? How do you get back to where you were and bring development? And then how successful was he? What did he focus on? So he said, Joseph Stalin said, we need to industrialize quickly to strengthen the Soviet Union and spread communism. And what he did was he centralized the economy around 5-year plans. Basically, the idea was we're going to figure out how much, we want this much electricity. We need to produce this much electricity to produce this many factories. Well, if we want this much electricity, we need this many power plants and we need this much coal. So we're going to organize our resources to meet these goals. This does not work in a complex economy like the United States, but for economies that were trying to industrialize rapidly, that were rural, this is great. It allows them to use their resources efficiently to engage in rapid industrialization. And in particular, they're going to focus on heavy industry rather than consumer goods. So by heavy industry, I mean things like building or making steel. And Stalin actually means man of steel, by the way. That was a name he picked himself. Kind of like Superman, but not. But in terms of evil, he's super. But he is going to focus on heavy industry rather than consumer goods. So he wants to make the Soviet Union powerful because then he can better survive and then spread communism. And this, I want to stress, he is successful in this. The Soviet Union, when Germany invades, is able to hold out economically. In World War One, the Russian economy was too weak in terms of industrialization, so it collapsed. In World War II, while it does get some help from the United States and Britain, it is able to survive. So what were the characteristics of the collectivization of farms? So during the Civil War, the peasants had been promised land if they supported the communists. However, after the Civil War, land was taken and peasants became laborers. The state now controlled farming and made sure food was available for workers to support industrialization. So basically, the land is taken from the farmers become laborers, and they're forced to grow food, but most of that food goes to the workers because they want to emphasize industrialization. And if you didn't comply with this, the government would make sure that you did not get food. And so this killed about 7 to 14 million people. And you watched a video clip about this. So it does not go well. What was the cult of the personality and the terror? Basically, Joseph Stalin presented himself as the all-knowing, all-wise leader, right? John, honey, you're going to have to stop. John, go over there. Go over there. Bring that over there and go. Stop. Sorry about that. So the cult of personality, you can see if you look at this image that Joseph Stalin is up here, looking down on the people who, of course, are all looking up to him. So this is meant to model how you're supposed to behave. If you're a Russian, you're supposed to look at Stalin and say, this is a great guy. He's awesome. He takes care of us. He loves us. He will protect us from our enemies who are everywhere. And there's some truth to that, right? Because a lot of people outside the Soviet Union and inside the Soviet Union oppose communism. So there was this kind of idea, a cult of personality, that the great leader knows all, he sees all, and he really cares about us, and he'll protect us from the evil outside of our country and the evil inside of our country. And of course, so he needs to have secret police. He needs to arrest people. He needs to shoot people. He needs to terrorize the opponents of the regime. Right? So you can see how those ideas are connected. You have a cult of personality, this all-wise, all-powerful leader who will protect us from the evil within our country and the evil outside our country. And of course, he needs terror to do that because our enemies are so bad. And this is a propaganda picture, but you can see how this kind of operates in real life. Here's a group of young communists meeting together under the watchful eye of Joseph Stalin. By the way, if you ever watch documentaries about like North Korea and they got pictures of Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-il up, this is where it comes from. It's this idea that the leader is everywhere. He's all-knowing. Why did some Chinese people become interested in communism? How did the Soviet Union help Chinese communists? The communists present themselves as an anti-imperialist alternative capitalist liberal democracy. So remember how we just talked about how the Chinese were treated very badly in the Versailles Treaty? Right? The communists are going the liberal democracies treat the Chinese very badly in the Versailles Treaty, will not give back land that was Chinese land originally. And the communists are like, well, that's really wrong. That's bad. And you know what? We communists, we're going to give up our old rights in China. We're going to sign new treaties based on equality. Now, they did backpedal from this. But they did sign treaties with China that were better than the ones that the liberal democracies had signed, and that gave the Chinese more stuff, right? Treated the Chinese with more respect. So the communists said, you know what? The liberal capitalist democracies are a bunch of imperialists. They want to take you over. They're never going to let you join their club. They betray you. They treat you badly. But we communists, we are going to be different. And so now Chinese had an alternative. So some Chinese said, you know what? Maybe this communism stuff will work. So the Soviet Union will send support like leadership, advisors, and money and weapons to help organize the Chinese Communist Party. And Mao Zedong is going to become one of the key leaders of this Communist Party. And we'll talk more about him later, but he's the guy that is going to help make China communist and lead it for the first few decades of its existence as a communist country. But what is interesting is, you may remember, I talked about how there was a theoretical division between communism and nationalism, because communism emphasized that class should come first, whereas nationalism emphasizes nation come first. However, for many people, especially in Asia, communism will become a means for obtaining national liberation. So people like Mao Zedong were communists and nationalists. That's one reason why communists will fight. The Chinese communists and the Russian Soviet Union communists will actually have several small wars later on. We don't talk about them in this class. The reason is because even though there's a theoretical division between communism and nationalism, in actuality, communism became a means for obtaining national liberation for people like Mao Zedong. They basically believed that communism would allow them to build an independent, free, and strong China, and an economically powerful one too. What were the characteristics of Italian fascism? How did Benito Mussolini seize power? Why is Italian fascism important? So post-war Italy faced an economic chaos and social chaos. And Benito Mussolini, who had been a socialist, builds a mass party around veterans who were disaffected to the war and pioneers an idea of fascism. We've already talked about that before. You can rewatch that video if you need to. And he builds a movement that was attractive to many veterans. And you can see that here in that picture of him. He's wearing a military-style uniform. He promised to basically kind of make Italy into a giant army, in a sense, like a barracks. And so he built a mass party, emphasizing this kind of militaristic understanding of society that was very attractive to many veterans who believed who craved the unity that they had experienced in the army. With those veterans, he will march on Rome in 1922. If the Italian government had wanted to, it could have called out the army to defeat Mussolini. I think they were afraid that the army would not attack Mussolini because so many of his supporters were veterans and they were therefore sympathetic to them. So instead of trying to destroy this movement, he was appointed prime minister. Basically, the idea was, we can't beat this guy. Let's make him a part of the government and use his support to strengthen the government. That did not work, and Mussolini seized power in 1924 completely. This model can be exported. Adolf Hitler is going to try and do this exact same thing. He will fail the first time. He will succeed the second time. So that brings us to the end of the Week 12 study guide. That's all the videos. I highly encourage you to watch all 4, and good luck on the exam.